Morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. The microphone working? Good morning. Could I ask you please to take your seats? Welcome to the opening session of the second day of the Belvedere Forum. I'd first of all like to thank our hosts, Chatham House, and the co-organisers of the event, PISM, for putting on such an interesting forum and continuing this great tradition. I've been to all four of the Belvedere Forum so far, and the events yesterday and what looks like in prospect today continue the great tradition of dialogue and discussion between Poland and Britain. This morning's session is both a very important and very timely topic. The question of sovereignty has been central in political and public discourse in both Poland and Britain in the last few years, and related issues of identity and history have been prominent as well. We have a really interesting panel today who come from a range of perspectives and backgrounds, and who will be able to tease out some of the similarities and differences in the way these issues are discussed in Britain and Poland. Just to introduce our panelists, myself, I'm Daniel Tillis, Editor-in-Chief of Notes from Poland, which is an online news and analysis service covering Poland in English. To my immediate left, we have Juliet Samuel, who is a columnist at The Telegraph. Next, we have Alex Szczerbiak, who is Professor of Politics and Contemporary European Studies at the University of Sussex. Then we have Jill Rutter, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the UK in a Changing Europe. And at the end, we have Dariusz Roszak, who's an independent Polish journalist, author of various books, including recently Oblicza Wielkiej Brytanii, meaning Faces of Great Britain. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give some introductory remarks for 3 or 4 minutes. I've asked them to keep it concise. And then, because this morning's session is not very long, it's only 1 hour, a bit shorter than yesterday's, I'm going to jump straight to questions from the audience. So please save up some questions as they're speaking, and I'll go immediately to the audience to speak. I've asked the panelists to be concise, and I'd very much ask the audience members in their thoughts and questions to be concise. And please do make sure you have a question as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts, but please make sure there is a question at the end. Oh, and finally, I've been told to remind you, just like yesterday's sessions, that we are on the record. We're in Chatham House, but Chatham House rules do not apply, so everything is on the record today. Could I please ask Professor Szczerbiak to begin with some thoughts?
Okay, thanks very much. Daniel, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be at this excellent forum. I'll try and be as lively as I can. I know it's first thing in the morning. People are still a little bit asleep. So what I'm going to talk about attitudes towards sovereignty in Britain a little bit, and in Poland mainly, through the prism of attitudes towards membership of the EU. In Britain, of course, we had the Brexit vote, and the key driver of the Brexit vote, according to opinion surveys, the slogan of the Brexit campaign was a desire to reassert national sovereignty, to take back control, if you like, over money, law, and borders. Poland is a country that is, or should be, acutely sensitive to the issue of sovereignty. 123 years without existing as a state, being again then wiped off the map by the Nazis, the Soviets, having 40-odd years as a kind of vassal communist Soviet state. So Poles should really care about national sovereignty. So do they, and how does that translate to their attitudes towards the EU? Well, when Poland joined the EU and voted overwhelmingly in a referendum to do so, nobody really thought very much about sovereignty. It was kind of overshadowed by this kind of overarching desire to reintegrate into Western international structures, the idea of this kind of historical civilizational choice of rejoining the West. So kind of sovereignty things were kind of put on the back burner, or indeed the idea of actually being able to make this choice was seen as an assertion of Polish sovereignty in the post-communist context. Since then, Poles have, if anything, got more pro-EU, at least in terms of the headline figure. 80–90% of Poles are in favour of membership of the European Union. There's no major party that calls for Polexit, for Poland to leave the European Union. So why is that the case? Do Poles, in spite of all of this, simply just not really care about their sovereignty? Well, I think that the answer here is that as this desire for the kind of historic civilizational choice, the kind of abstract romantic notion of rejoining the West has faded, increasingly, I think, Poles have been prepared to trade off sovereignty, or pool sovereignty, if you want to use the federalist language, for certain gains, for economic benefits, for example, the ability to access Western labour markets initially, and now it wasn't so important to start with, but now things like EU funds and market access. For geopolitical reasons, the idea that, you know, Poland, given its geopolitical position, particularly in terms of Russia, has got to be integrated into Western international structures, and if that means trading off a certain amount of sovereignty to maintain that security position, so be it. For liberals, for Polish liberals, it's the idea of the EU as representing certain kind of values or rights, if you like. You know, we're prepared to trade off sovereignty in certain areas in order to be part of an organisation that embeds and defends these rights. So are there limits to the trade-off that Poles will be prepared to make? Well, I think that really depends how far the EU extends into what people believe are or should be the core competencies of a state, of a nation state. So let me give you an example. The attitudes of the church and a lot of socially conservative Poles, okay, which a lot of Poles are, they follow the church's teaching. The church, after a lot of humming and hawing, came down in favour of being a member of the EU because it separated out processes of secularisation, the sexual revolution, these kind of, you know, social liberal processes from the European Union. Okay, it separated those two things out. Okay, and it brought into the idea that the European Union doesn't interfere into moral cultural questions. That's the kind of core, if you like, of what states should be about, and as long as it doesn't interfere in that, they're broadly sympathetic of Polish membership of the European Union. What about the current governments? You know, where do they stand on this? Well, they also are willing to trade off, to pool sovereignty to some extent, but they do see the potential threat to sovereignty in certain core areas. Okay, they do believe that the Commission, the European institutions, are overreaching in particular areas, such as the role of the national competencies over determining the structure and the role of the judiciary. So why don't they oppose the European Union? Well, a cynic might say it would be political suicide for any mainstream political party to come out against the European Union. And obviously there's a certain political calculation. But there's also, I think, a philosophical justification for the government's position, which is that it believes that these areas that the EU is encroaching into are a contested space. Okay? It believes it can push back against these things. Okay, so I guess it's kind of where, I mean, this was the thing that Gisela Stewart said in the opening session, it's kind of where the British Conservative government was, or a lot of British Conservatives were in the early 2010s, before they came to the conclusion that they couldn't push back and that Britain had to leave the European Union. But while it sees, the current government sees that threat to sovereignty in certain core areas that it believes should be the realm of the nation state, it also believes that they can push back. And contest that. And my final comment is really about, again, it's about, you know, what are the limits of this? I think the scariest moment for somebody who's a supporter of the EU in Poland was the European migration crisis, because the feeling among not just political elites but many Poles that the migrant relocation scheme implied enforced multiculturalism. Okay, it implied pushing into competencies that really should be the core decisions of a state, whether or not to become multicultural or not, was a decision that many Poles felt that they were willing to make. And there was some really interesting polling going on at that time, which shows that Poles were, for example, prepared to lose EU funding, okay, if it meant standing up to the EU on the migration quota scheme. In fact, there was even one opinion poll that said that a majority of Poles would actually be able to be in favour of leaving the European Union if they were forced to join the European migration location scheme. Okay, so I think that's where we are. I think that, you know, Poles are conscious about national sovereignty. I think they're prepared to trade it off or pool it, depending whatever language you want to use, to some extent. But I think that there are kind of clear limits to where they think that trade-off can be made. And obviously it's different for different people, but that limit is when you start to get into what people think are the core competencies of what states should be determining.
Thank you very much, Alex. So we've heard something about how these debates look from the perspective of Polish politics. Jill, would you like to say something about the British angle on this?
Yes, I think that's quite a big topic, and try and confine it to 2 or 3 minutes as you requested. At the moment, we're in the middle of a sort of giant natural experiment about quite how big a price are we as a country prepared to pay for regaining the sort of sovereignty that Alex was talking about, the one offered in the referendum of taking back control, which you could argue is the biggest vote of confidence ever in British politicians, that if we have to choose between who gets to make decisions, we prefer British politicians to preferring European bureaucrats, technocrats, or whatever you like to say it. There was a friend of mine did an interview with Bill Cash, who is one of the longest-standing Eurosceptics in the Conservative Party. He's seen the Conservative Party move towards him from having had quite an outlier position perhaps 20 years ago. And this was on the day of Brexit, the 31st of January, and a friend of mine said to me, if the UK economy shrank by 50% as a result of Brexit, would it still be worth doing? And he said, yes. I think he's at the extreme end of the price that people will see as worth paying for Brexit. But clearly one of the big problems that the Remain campaign had was that it saw this in purely economic terms, and people who voted leave for a whole variety of reasons, but the economic fear-mongering was not quite enough to cut it and get those to defect over to the Remain side. Brexit remains a giant fissure in British politics. Survey in mid-2018 showed that whereas party identification was now a really minority sport, only 18% of people declared that they had a sort of long-standing affiliation to a political party. Only 1 out of every 16 people did not identify themselves with either Leave or Remain. So it has become this sort of giant dividing line between people. It's also, I think, quite interestingly, the idea of national sovereignty, and national sovereignty, indeed nominal sovereignty, as being something that it's worth paying some sort of economic price for. It's quite interesting because the biggest sort of indicator, one of the biggest indicators that you will vote for Leave is that you identify exclusively as English. If you identify exclusively as English, you are 2 to 1 likely to have voted Leave in the referendum. That's not true for any of those other identities. They just sort of split much more evenly. I think one of the problems that the UK has always had is we've always, as a nation, been quite Eurosceptic with a very small e. We were late into the EU, we know that. We didn't join until 1973. We have basically, I worked in the UK government from 1978 to 2009, and throughout that time, we were always sort of rubbing up against bits of the European project, not the single market, but in other areas, we were always seeking exceptional treatment. We were floating alternatives to the euro. The UK became a very big advocate of widening the EU, partly for worthy geopolitical reasons, but also for reasons that we thought widening was an alternative to deepening. And we thought that if the EU embarked on a campaign of widening, it couldn't simultaneously pursue projects like the euro, which we were very sceptical about. That, of course, was a wrong judgment by the UK. I think what we're about to see is whether the nominal sovereignty that we're regaining actually delivers the sort of practical benefits. We've had the UK's Europe debate was very hampered by the fact that politicians of all major parties never really made a case for the fact that we derived any benefits from pooling our sovereignty with Europe. And David Cameron, in his autobiography, makes it clear that actually that meant that the Remain campaign was starting so far behind and saying, actually, there is a benefit to some of these sacrifices in terms of nominal control. They couldn't make that case then. I think we're about to have some illustrations to say, actually, is the price that we may end up paying as we enter into our negotiations. is there tolerance for that? The other thing I would say is if you make the case that that actually nominal sovereignty is where it's at, practical sovereignty is less so. It's much harder to make the case against Scottish independence or indeed down the line against reunification in Northern Ireland.
Thank you very much. So we've heard a lot about sovereignty so far. The other part of our remit was identity and also questions of history, how history impacts upon identity as well. And Dariusz, I think you'd like to say a few words about how that looks from a Polish perspective.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for the invitation. There used to be a time not that long ago when economics explained the human condition. I'm sure you all remember that. It's economy, stupid. Where the words like global or flexibility or austerity were the key words to understanding what's going on in the world. This time is gone. I don't know if it's gone for good, but it's gone for a long time, probably. Now, global is replaced by local. We don't want to be flexible. And by that, I mean in all metaphorical senses. We still go to the gym because we want to be plastic people. But we are fed up with a market which is based on flexibility. We want to have security in our jobs. And we believe that local means something, and sovereignty, be it national or as understood as a community, as based in a community, still stands out as an important issue for many people. And it's identity that replaces the economics. It's identity that replaces the key to understanding politics and social issues. And I think identity is central to understanding also the political and social landscape of today's Poland. Let me pass through a few watershed moments which I think are central to understanding why Polish politics works the way it does at the moment. And they all refer to current history or recent history, starting obviously with 1989. And how you interpret that date and how you see the reform process that followed places you in a very special environment, political and social environment in today's Poland. Whether you see it as a liberation, as a true liberation, and the beginning of independent Poland, or a continuation of communist Poland, perhaps a coup d'etat acquisition of sorts of Poland by elites from the Communist Party, which conspired with the elites from the democratic opposition. Let's fast forward to 2004, accession to the European Union. As Alex mentioned, this was a historical moment for many Poles, for a great majority of Poles. We saw it as a fulfillment of history, basically. We assumed it was like Euro 96 in England. Poland's coming home. We're coming back to where we belonged, where we've always been. And it's only just that we do it. What it meant for Polish politics at the time is we didn't ask questions about what the European Union was. There was one politician who actually questioned, or one political party that questioned not necessarily the whole project, but the foundation on which the project was based, which was self-defense, obviously. And they were treated like barbarians. There was no mainstream media debate about the results, the possible results and potential consequences of joining the European Union by Poland. Let's fast forward to 2010 and Smolensk plane crash. And again, the interpretation of that fact places you in a particular political camp, political and social. This is much more than politics. This is the fundamental idea of how Poland is structured at the moment in social terms. Whether you treat it as an unfortunate, tragic plane disaster or as a political phenomenon, as a political development, perhaps a conspiracy in the extreme cases between the Polish government run by Mr. Tusk and Russian government run by Mr. Putin, who conspired to kill Polish elites like they did 70 years earlier in Katyn, places you in a particular social bubble, let's put it that way, if we want to use the internet terms. And again, let's fast forward to 2015 and the refugee crisis, and Alex mentioned that again, which was obviously not about refugees at all. And I think it applies to most countries. We didn't talk about the refugees. We didn't care that much about them, just like we probably don't care about them, about the refugees who are at the Greek border at the moment. But we're talking about the European Union now. And when we talked about the refugees in 2015, we talked about ourselves and how we want to treat ourselves. Whether, again, we're coming back to this idea that there is a division in Poland between the mainstream liberal, enlightened European core of modern citizens, or whether we want to be barbarians outside of the European Union, because that was how it was presented, actually on both sides of the debate. So perhaps this for a start.
Thank you very much. Okay, and finally, Juliet, could we have some comments from you?
So I'm going to talk about British history, how our image of history has informed our identity and our political identity. And there's a notorious summary of how the British education system teaches us our own history. We start with 1066 and the invasion of the Normans. Then we go up to the Tudors and the Shakespeare and Henry VIII's Six Wives. And then we fast forward right to the Nazis. And in the middle, obviously, we miss out a little thing called the British Empire. I think I maybe was made to colour in a map age 6, something like that. But despite accusations brought on by Brexit, particularly from the continent, that it's all about pining for Empire 2.0, I actually think that one of the striking things about that aspect of our history is that this country has largely forgotten it, at least in a conscious cultural sense, except that maybe it's left us with a latent sense of confidence about the world, or someone, I suppose, would say overconfidence. So I hope that that is a caricature about the education system now, but I do think that the culture, whether it's history documentaries or people teaching their dogs Nazi salutes as a joke, or the film Darkest Hour, or people playing the board game Secret Hitler, which involves forming coalitions in the Reichstag to try and stop Hitler coming to power. I think that our identity is enormously informed by World War II and by the image of Britain standing alone against a mightier power that is trying to control us. And obviously we weren't standing alone financially or militarily, but in the sense of feeling an existential threat to this country, and then feeling afterwards vindicated by a huge moral victory. I think that is a hugely important sense of ourselves as a country. And I think one of the political legacies it's left Britain with is a great sense of rebellion against anything that looks like intimidation, particularly foreign intimidation, telling the country that it can't do particular things, but also a great sense of cynicism about appeals to unity or togetherness that come from abroad, and a sense that there's clearly an ulterior motive there and it's not what it seems. But the upshot, I think, is that the idea of the nation and national sovereignty is here associated with the idea of prosperity and a march towards increasing rights or democracy. And that's very unlike the notion of the nation on the continent, for example, or in large parts of the continent, although perhaps not in Poland, and that might be one thing we share in common. And some people would even trace this march to national democracy back, 800 years to the Magna Carta. But the point is that the nation is not a dirty word, and nationalism may be a slightly dubious word, but patriotism certainly isn't. And I think there was a phrase that Jill used a couple of times, nominal sovereignty, that the idea that Brexit is essentially a trade for a sort of imaginary idea of control, that we want an imaginary idea of control rather than real control in the negotiating rooms of Brussels and such like that. I think that actually the jury is still out on that. We don't know exactly how Brexit's going to pan out, and there are certainly large parts of the economy and society that we will be getting control over, not least immigration policy. But the fact that we're also even having national debates about trade, or about to, I think is not a nominal fact, it is a real fact. If any political facts are real, then that is a real fact. And so I think that the nation is a still relevant unit, in the sense, and it's relevant because people have decided it's relevant, just as people decide that other units, which may be imaginary, like the tribe or common humanity or even the nuclear family, are relevant units. The nation and national sovereignty is a politically important unit, and is not just important, and is not an impediment that we have to get past, but I think something that is actually valuable because it enables us to get things done. It enables decisions to be taken. And one of the problems that the EU has seen is it's sort of frozen in indecision because there isn't that political legitimacy backing up the unit that is trying to make decisions, and therefore there's all sorts of power dispersed so much that it can't make those decisions. But I think broadly, the notion that the nation is outdated, people often link it to the idea that our problems are so geographically big that we obviously need a political unit that matches, that's as big as our problems are. But I think this misunderstands human progress as a march towards homogeneity, when in fact the way we have solved problems is through experimentation and trial and error, as much in politics as in science or any other field. And we can see this actually with what's happening right now with the coronavirus. There isn't one uniform approach across the world. There is obviously coordination, sharing of information, but each country is taking its own approach in accordance with its attitude to risk, or to social costs, or to rights. And I think that you could translate something like that across to much more politically difficult problems like climate change, where there are obviously winners and losers, and that makes it harder. But I don't see why the geographic scale of a problem necessarily lends itself to a geographic political unit that matches that problem. But I think that the upshot of this is that if you take away a people's sense of distinctness and a sense of their identity as a unit, you actually take away their commonality as well, because you take away their desire to act for one another and to feel solidarity with one another. And that, I think, is one of a major driving factor behind the way Brexit is seen in this country.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of our panellists for their introductory remarks and for keeping them fairly concise. Once again, I'd like to ask the audience with their questions to do the same, to keep them as concise as possible, make sure there is a question. I'd like to gather sets of 3 questions to give our panellists an opportunity to answer some of them. We'll try and have a couple of rounds of questions. We've got 20 minutes or so left. Are the microphones going around? Great. Could we ask this lady in the centre at the back there for the first question, please?
Thank you. I'd like to refer back to the idea of patriotism and see whether the rest of the panellists agree with what I think I understood Juliet to be saying. I'm a Pole born in Britain, born and brought up in Britain, and I've always found that Polish patriotism is a sort of stronger, more obvious, more good thing, seen to be a good thing. I've been accused on occasions of being unpatriotic because I, brought up in Britain, I feel I have a more kind of diffident approach. I mean, Juliet, you talked about patriotism being a strong thing in Britain and so on. To me, comparing it with Poland and with the way Polish people treat and talk about patriotism, I think it's certainly in what might be called polite society. It doesn't do to be overtly, flag waving, literally even flag waving and so on. That's always what I've found, that there is a distinct difference between what patriotism means in Britain and what it means to Polish people. I don't know whether, my question is, do other panelists see that?
Thank you very much. Could we have question over here on the left, the gentleman over here? Yes, please. Oh, sorry, is that Anthony Polonsky? Yes, please, go ahead.
I'd like to put to the panel what I see as one of the differences between England and Poland in attitudes towards the European project. It seems to me the European project has 2 aspects to it. On the one hand, it's an attempt to create an economic union. How far this should go is disputed, but that its goal is to make a larger market which will facilitate economic well-being. But on the other side, it rests on the idea that we have a common European fatherland, that we have a common history which is divisive, but which we are trying to overcome, and this unites us. And this second aspect of the European project is something which resonates in Poland and is shown in the public opinion polls. Poles think of themselves as Europeans, but it doesn't resonate except for a rather small group. People like myself who consider themselves English but came from somewhere else, adopted English or an English identity as a result of studying in this country. It's a minority opinion here, and this is why the European debate didn't work the way that the people who wanted to remain hoped it would, because the sense that we are really Europeans and that we have a common history is not widely dispersed in this country.
Thank you very much. One more question, please. Down here at the front, Stanley Bill.
Hi, thanks for all those contributions. I have a quick question for Alex about multiculturalism and about the Polish government's attitude to this quite complex issue. It seems to me that it's not multiculturalism will be imposed on Poland by the European Commission, but rather by economic necessity and above all the demands of the labour market. So I wonder about how you would look at this strange game that the government's playing, that on the one hand talking about the taking on of 7,000 people, 7,000 refugees, by a country of 38 million, and that as the imposition of multiculturalism. But since then, we've seen tens of thousands of residence permits issued to people from Turkey, 13,000 from Turkey in 2018 alone. So that's double that number, from Nepal and India as well, and of course hundreds of thousands from Ukraine and Belarus. So is it really about resistance to the imposition of multiculturalism, or is it something else? How's the government negotiating that contradiction in their rhetoric?
Thank you very much. So, Juliet, one of the questions was a response to your comments about patriotism. Would you like to say something more?
And I think you wanted to hear from others, but I do have something to say in response. I mean, the way that the phrase flag waving is used in many parts of London pejorative term, I think is actually a measure of the gap between elites and most people in this country. I actually think this is quite a patriotic country, although it is all relative. A friend of mine was giving a talk in Germany recently, and he began his talk by saying, raise your hand if you're proud of your country. And 3 people put up their hand, and they were all non-Germans. And I think in this country you would get a lot more hands than that. So maybe it's all relative, but I do think that out there in the UK, this is actually a very proud country, and maybe not to the degree or in the same way as in Poland, but I think relatively within the European context.
Thank you. Dariusz, would you like to respond on patriotism or one of the other issues?
I think this tension between how people understand patriotism and national sovereignty, and it is central to understanding the division within the Polish society at the moment. And we have this phrase about the culture of shaming, which allegedly we had lived until the Law and Justice Party took over. The culture of shaming meant making Poles feel ashamed of everything we did during the war, after the war, during communism, and in the current history as well. On the other hand, I think what the current authorities discovered very well is that Poles had been fed up with this sort of narrative, with this sort of discourse, and they wanted to feel proud of their country. They wanted to feel proud of their achievements. They wanted to feel proud both of the economic achievements and cultural achievements. And I think this is extremely important because this division comes back time and time again in Polish politics. We haven't touched, and probably we won't have time to touch upon the Polish-Jewish relationship. But this is one of the things which is central to this culture of shaming, whether we should be ashamed of how Jews were treated in Poland right after the war, how Poles behaved towards them during the war. I think one of the things that definitely changed in 2015 was an influx of this, or rather the rejection of this culture of shame.
Thank you. Jill, I don't know if you wanted to respond to Professor Polonsky's question about the European project or pick up on one of the other issues.
I think he's clearly right. I actually don't think the Rain campaign particularly did campaign on any sort of resonance with sort of European identity, because I think they sort of knew that for most people that was a bit of a non-starter. So I think actually the striking thing is, I think on Juliet's point about patriotism, there's been a bit of an attempt, I think, with the Olympics and things like that, to reclaim flag waving from the sort of far right nationalists, which is what it had become slightly too over-associated with, that you'd be embarrassed being seen waving Union Jacks and things like that. I think the key thing about England or whatever is really insularity. And I think that's one of the sort of dominant things. We've now seen lots of people come here and make cities like London their home, but we remain, I think, still fundamentally quite insular. We don't speak many other languages. We probably have bigger social connections to the former empire through the big, Commonwealth countries, big amounts of Commonwealth immigrants who are also in the UK. So I think we really have much more of a sense, of insularity. And even people who have lived in Europe still refer to Europe as something different. It's a place you go to. It's not a place that you are here. And I think those sorts of things are really quite deeply entrenched. They may not be if I was talking to a bunch of 22-year-olds, but I still think that's sort of part of our heritage, is that we are physically separate. It felt very different. When I was 18, I went and lived in Germany. When we wanted to go for a French meal, we drove to France because we lived in Karlsruhe, which is very, very different from the distance that we have. It's another reason why I think Ireland is so different as well, with the border there.
Thank you very much. And Alex, would you like to respond to the question on multiculturalism?
Yeah. Can I just say something about the others as well? Yeah, so I actually agree with Julia about the question about the different... I think Poles and Brits are actually quite similar in terms of their attitudes, and I think the bigger divide is between cultural elites and the masses in terms of their attitude towards the nation and patriotism, with the slight caveat that I think Polish cultural elites are probably a bit more comfortable about patriotism than British cultural elites. British cultural elites are okay about nationalism for countries other than Britain. I've got lots of Polish national symbols in my office, and everyone seems very relaxed about it. If I had lots of British flags in my office, I don't think people would be. I don't know. If I had Scottish flag, they'd probably be okay about it. If I had an Irish flag, they'd probably be okay about it, but not a British flag. That would be a problem. Or an English flag. Yeah. So the thing about the difference between Poles and Brits on seeing themselves as European, I think the big difference was that in Britain, it's possible to construct a historical narrative that doesn't have being a member of the European Union as the logical conclusion at the end of it. And certainly when Poland joined the EU, I mean, the most powerful kind of campaign ads that were produced by the Yes campaign, if you like, the Join campaign, were the ones that located Poland joining the European Union as the logical conclusion of a series of historic events that led to Poland being, in this, kind of abstract and romantic way, reunited with the West. I actually think that's fading. Okay, I think that was correct for that generation, but I think current generations are much more instrumental about it, exemplified by the fact that it's the youngest demographic in Poland that is the most Eurosceptic, and a kind of mirror image of what you have in Britain. On the question of multiculturalism, is it culture, is it sovereignty? I think it's kind of both, basically. I think there is a cultural element to it in terms of the Polish government and a lot of Poles' reaction to the migration crisis. I think they think that the West made a catastrophic mistake in allowing such large communities to develop that are very difficult to assimilate. Okay, at best, and at worst, provide a breeding ground for violent extremism, and the contrast here being with huge numbers of Ukrainians who've come over to Poland and obviously are much easier to assimilate. So I think it's partly that, but I think the core of it, of their argument, was about sovereignty. And I mean, the number is, well, what's 7,000? We can easily assimilate that. That's not a problem. But the question here was, who makes that decision? Who decides that we become a multicultural state? And once you concede the principle that a supranational body can determine that, that's a line that from the Polish government's point of view, and actually from a lot of Poles' point of view, they were not prepared to cross. And I think that's the key thing. So yes, there are lots of inconsistencies, because there are people from Muslim countries, as you say, coming to Poland, but it's still of a piece with the idea that these are decisions that are taken by the Polish government and not taken by supranational bodies in response to pressure from a domestic political problem that the German government found itself in, or at least that's the government's argument, and a lot of Poles agreed with that.
Thank you very much. Could we get 3 more questions, please? This gentleman at the front here. Could you wait for the microphone, please?
Two very brief things. So one is, I noticed that you use the term English and British patriotism interchangeably. Now, as someone living in Edinburgh, the question is, if we take Professor Sterbiak's point about local and localism and so on seriously, isn't the logical development of that Scottish independence? And the second point is about religion, which kind of came up on several occasions. There is a general, I mean not 100%, but there's a general tendency that Protestant countries tend to be much more Eurosceptic than Catholic. And in fact, within the same country, like Netherlands, when they had a referendum on European constitution, the Protestant part voted against, the Catholic voted for it. So isn't that also one of the differences, that in a way for Catholic countries like Poland, the idea of being part of a bigger system is not necessarily an anathema. The point is which kind of policy that group dictates. Whether in Britain, any kind of external control, even if they have the same value, would be problematic.
Thank you very much. I think there was one question. The gentleman sitting over here. Yeah, sorry, thank you.
Hello, Przemysław Biskup from PISM. I wanted to ask one question concerning, let's say, revolutionary or evolutionary nature what happened in Britain in 2016 and in Poland, let's say, in 2015. To what extent it's possible to claim that actually those, let's say, that those feelings, those attitudes that were demonstrated by the Brexit referendum and by change of government in Poland in 2015, they were the result of the moment, in a sense, and to what extent they were there for quite a long time. At that point, I'm speaking specifically from Polish perspective, but were underrepresented within the political system, party system, due to different deficiencies within the organization of that system. I would be very interested to hear opinions about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And let's try and get an even spread across the room. There was a question at the front here from the professor.
Thank you very much. Przemysław Żurawski-Welgrejewski, University of Łódź. I would like to stress the fact that to explain the situation in Poland after joining of the European Union, we have to remember that the European Union is evolving all the time, and the structure that was joined by Poland in 2004 is not the same that exists today. And for example, when we joined the Union, we had only 2 votes less than Germany. Now we have 50% of that votes in the European Union Council. That's the first observation. The second, as far as the attitude towards multiculturalism and immigration is concerned, I have already said it before, but please remember that the core question is that those people who are expected to be sent to Poland were expected to be sent against their will. That was not the situation in which anybody was marching to Poland or landing on Polish shore or crossing Polish territory or storming Polish frontiers. Yeah? That was the administrative decision taken against the entire policy that was advised to Polish government since 1997.
Sorry to interrupt. I think this was an issue you covered yesterday in the plenary.
Yeah, but
do you have a question for the panelists?
Well, so the question is that it was not, as Mr. Rosiak said, it was not division between the barbarians and the civilized Europeans. Yeah? Don't you think that it was rather division between those who wanted to be the citizens and not just the inhabitants of the country, where the previous government, that was a populist one, and who was promising to the people comfortable life, where all the high politic decisions will be taken by those wise people from the West, while you should limit your activity for your private life. That means having fun in your gardens, yeah, or playing football. And that was the political proposal to the Poles before, while the protection of the country would be granted to the more experienced structures of the wiser people from the West. And that is not the reality you can run the country, especially, and just another question, another issue.
I have to stop you there. We've only got 5 minutes left.
Please remember that we sent troops to fight Islamists since 2001, and then we were told that there is no threat.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have 5 minutes left. Sorry to those who still had questions. We're running short of time. Could I ask each of the panelists very briefly, just in a minute and a half, to give some thoughts on any of the questions that were asked? Jill, could you begin, please?
Okay, I think English and British patriotism and identification are different. There are some people who say they're English and British, some people who identify as English exclusively. I think one of the sort of surprising results of the Brexit referendum has been how much some people who are supporters of Brexit are prepared to sacrifice to get that result. And in particular, I think the poll that showed that a lot of Conservative supporters, members, I can't remember which, were prepared to see the union break up. It is supposed to be the Conservative and Unionist Party. I think that's been a bit of a bit of a shock that was so lightly tolerated, that 50% saying that. I think the really interesting thing about your question about religion is that I've seen millions of surveys splitting up how, who voted what in terms of identity on the Brexit vote. I haven't seen one for the UK that does it on religion. And actually, that's because we're fundamentally such an a-religious country here. And I think that's probably one of the very big differences with Poland, that even though we have an established nationalised church, its main effect is to basically mean that religion is not really a very significant factor.
Thank you very much. Alex, would you like to comment?
So just picking up on that, I mean, historically, yes, Catholic. The Catholic Church has been more relaxed about supranational organisations. I mean, one of the core elements of Christian democracy was that it was anti-nationalist, that it was an internationalist political philosophy. I think Jill's absolutely right. I mean, in most cases, religion just it doesn't make any difference, whether a country's Protestant or Catholic in that sense. I think what's more important now is to what extent are countries religious, and to what extent does that religiosity inform social values, and to what extent is the EU seen as representing a set of social values which are hostile to or sympathetic to the social values that people who take religion very seriously do. And I think this is where it's important in Poland, because as I said at the beginning, the Catholic Church was pro-EU. It was very relaxed about the idea of the EU because it separated out social processes that were happening in the West, sort of, left liberal, the Cultural Revolution, if you like, from what was happening in the EU. Okay, and to the extent that the EU starts to become a socially liberal left project, okay, that then creates a problem for organisations like the Catholic Church and for individuals who hold those social values and their attitude towards the European Union is driven by that. And I think that's the point about the EU evolving is a really important point. I'll cite some fellow academics. This is the point Holmes and Krastev made. Okay, the EU has become a moving target for a lot of people in Central and Eastern Europe. The things that they signed up for at the time, the EU is constantly moving on and saying that in order to be a European, to share European values, you have to come into line with this, which was something very different from the mid-2000s. And I think that whole area of kind of moral cultural issues exemplifies that, basically. The EU is kind of pushing into those moral cultural issues and saying, yes, these are European values, and to be a member of the EU, you have to kind of go along with this, and that's creating pushback from people who are religious or social conservatives.
Thank you very much. Juliet, would you like to make some remarks?
Yes, on the Catholic versus Protestant point, I haven't seen polling on that, but I think I saw something, and I can't remember if it was polling or a less quantitative study saying that if you had a Norman surname versus an Anglo-Saxon surname, that informed how likely you were to vote for Brexit, the Normans being more pro-EU than the Anglo-Saxons. And I wouldn't be surprised if that were borne out. Perhaps also because those things also track class to an astonishing degree over 1,000 years later. I do think that maybe your point about the idea of a Catholic country feeling more at home as part of a whole, I think is relevant to the way the UK has always seen sort of entanglements from the continent as attempts to control, whether it's the Pope or Brussels. I do think, some people think that's a stretch, but I do think that there's a sort of subconscious commonality there that has continued on. On the point of patriotism, there's definitely a difference between English and British patriotism, but I think that, but there is definitely a British sense of identity that goes across Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland as well. The Queen is very popular in Scotland, for example, as is the pound. And so, although I do worry about Scottish independence growing in popularity or likelihood, there is a real sense of identity and sovereignty that does cross the whole, British Isles. If it's just as to whether the politics will align or fracture that. And I think that on the point of whether Brexit was a sort of moment or an accident, or whether it was there for a long time, I think it's the result of very long-standing sort of struggles, political internal struggles in the UK with how we interact with the outside world and what our relationship to Europe is. And there's a kind of narrative in, particularly in, I think this is Guy Verhofstadt's favourite interpretation of Brexit, is that it was a psychodrama inside the Tory party, and it was just an accident that this somehow spilled out into a major geopolitical event. I think that's rubbish, and it's a very sort of microscopically, maybe it suits the sort of, it's a way for certain aspects of the EU to have no introspection about what exactly has gone wrong with the whole project, is to put it down to this sort of accidental event. And I think on the point about Poland versus Germany, I mean, the balance of power has shifted in the EU, and the euro, I think, was for this country the most relevant moment when it got out of balance to a point where it was politically unsustainable for the UK.
Thank you very much. And we're already slightly over time, although we did start a little bit late, not your fault. Dariusz, could you make some final comments very briefly, please?
I'm going to try to be brief, just to point to the similarities and differences between the two crucial moments in recent history. 2015 in Poland, the accession of Law and Justice Party government, and 2016 in Britain. I think there are similarities and one major difference, obviously. The similarities, I think, is that both of these were about taking back control and trying to take back control from the supranational institutions that run our lives. And there is enough people in Poland, at least, I think, and I think in Britain as well, who started questioning the reason behind it. If you have the justice system, the economics, and large parts of law established outside of your domain, and then you start asking questions, and the question of the aspiration, civilizational or historical aspiration of Poles becomes less relevant, and apparently there is enough people in Poland who are ready to question the European Union's influence on their lives. The major difference between the two is, of course, that Brexit is going to be done and it's going to stay, whether part of British nation wants it or not, whereas the Law and Justice Party is going to lose power at some point, and we're going to have a different government, and there's going to be a different resolution and perhaps a different political landscape in Poland.
Thank you very much. Before we thank our panel, I've been asked to raise two issues of housekeeping. You will have noticed on the chairs yesterday and today these feedback forms, these yellow feedback forms. Chatham House would be very grateful if you were able to fill these out and give your feedback on the events yesterday and today. And finally, sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but there is no coffee break after this session. You'll have to survive a little bit longer. We're going to go immediately in about 10 minutes to the breakout sessions. In this room, the conference room, there will be the session on society and culture, law and politics. In the Astor room, there will be the session on politics and international affairs. And in the simulation center, I'm not sure where these rooms are, but I'm sure staff will direct you. In the simulation center will be the session on business and economics, the urban-rural divide. I'd like to thank my panelists for what I think was a really interesting discussion. Can we please give a round of applause to everyone?